We begin with Edward Said. According to the New York Times, he changed the face of scholarship on the Arab world. Edward Said was born in Jerusalem, raised in Egypt, and educated in the United States. After receiving his Ph.D. in English literature at Harvard, he became a professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia. And then, following the Six-Day War in 1967, he was politicized. He met Yasser Arafat, sat on the Palestine National Council, and he became the most outspoken American defender of Palestinian self-determination. He's written over a dozen books and recently published 2 new collections of essays, Representation of the Intellectual and the Politics of Dispossession. I'm very pleased to have Edward Said back here at this table. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's good to see you again.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Boy, so much has happened. Let me just walk through it with you. I mean, today's headlines are Rabin and Hussein, and building between Aqaba and Alat, Hussein and Rabin in Washington, Arafat and Rabin in Washington. Are we one Assad away from peace in the Middle East?
Well, it's difficult to tell, but I think probably in the end, yes, I think there will be a peace agreement with Syria. I don't think Assad has much choice, but he's trying to get the best deal he can, I think.
And is that a good thing?
I think peace is very good, of course, and I'm for it. Unfortunately, the Palestinian side of the whole equation, you know, the peace that was signed in Washington.
What I meant, obviously.
Yeah, well, that has been to me at least, tremendous disappointment, and I think it expresses more a capitulation on the Palestinian side than it does an achievement towards peace. I think what Arafat got was a tiny pair of enclaves, one of which, Gaza, the Israelis have been trying to get rid of for a long time, and the other, Jericho, is a 50 square mile area, which he supposedly controls. But in fact, the Israelis are still there.
But if you looked at the reality, why isn't it a good idea for the Palestinians or the PLO to make that a deal? When you looked at the reality they had and the alternative they had, and the fact that this might be the first step towards all of the West Bank, etc.
Well, there are 2 reasons to give, to respond to that. One is it wasn't the only alternative. There was a whole series of alternatives starting back in the 70s, some of which I was associated with, that Arafat and his group turned down out of, I think, stupidity. And the second thing is that the agreement made in Oslo last summer was really done with Arafat himself with his back to the wall. He had isolated himself. He had made foolish mistakes, beginning with the Gulf War. He was at a low ebb in terms of popularity and money and so on and so forth. So I think the agreement was a way of saving himself rather than thinking of his people. And, you know, the obvious parallel is Mandela in South Africa, who never wavered from his principles, although he was in jail for 27 years, and said, listen, what we want in the end is one person, one vote. We want the end of apartheid. Now, nothing in the agreements that Arafat has signed, whether Oslo or Cairo or whatever, says anything about the end of occupation. The Israelis are still there. The armies are still there. The settlements are still there. The settlements are increasing in size and number. In the months that he signed the agreements in September until now, the Israelis have confiscated another 20,000 acres of Palestinian land. So it's a terrible deal. And another additional reason is it was negotiated with tremendous incompetence. I mean, he didn't even have a lawyer with the Israelis or legal advisor.
Outgunned or
outgunned, unprepared. All he wanted was to assure himself something so that he could continue. And now he's in Gaza, and you read the papers. I mean, he's unable to cope. He has no history, no experience in government, and he's alienated most of his good people. And it's a tremendous tragedy for the people, and that's what bothers me, because from the public relations point of view, you know, it's a great scoop, the White House lawn, peace, and so on and so forth. But the fact is that more Palestinians have been killed since the thing was signed. You heard about the massacre, of course, at Hebron. The settlers, in other words, all the important problems have simply been postponed.
And terrorism in Buenos Aires and other places.
The whole cycle, exactly. So it's public relations, Israel getting its strategic objectives, you know, the Arabs capitulating left, right, and center without coordinating at all. And Jordan has signed an agreement now, which, you know, I mean, there's very little between Jordan and Israel to dispute. I mean, there's 100 and some square miles near the Dead Sea, but they'll be settled. But the important thing is that Israel is now achieving a kind of power in the Middle East, which makes it the superpower of the region. And it's essentially going to get entree into economic markets and so on and so forth. And the Arabs have no strategy. their societies are crumbling from within in the most dreadful way. And in my opinion, the future really looks very, very bleak.
For the Palestinians or for what?
Well, I think certainly for the Palestinians in the short run. I don't think Arafat will survive very long. He can't.
Because he will be assassinated, or because someone will...
I think the main problem right now is, for example, all the hospitals in Gaza are short of oxygen. He has to supply oxygen. He has to pay for his police force. He has to provide the teachers with money. He has to pave the roads. He's never done that. He has no money. The international community has promised X number of hundreds of millions of dollars, and they're simply not coming in because he refuses to be accountable. You see, they say, we'll give you money, but you have to tell us what the money's for.
You leave me with a lot to ask, but let me just start with this.
Yes.
Most of what you say seems to lie at the feet of Chairman Arafat. A, he could have had some better agreements in the past. B, it is Palestinians who insisted that the Israelis deal with Arafat. They much more would have preferred dealing with other Palestinians.
No, I don't think so. I think not. I think they prefer. I mean, I
well,
think
they may now, but
yeah,
but I remember times in which, I mean, there's a whole wing of Israelis who believe that Arafat is a war criminal and don't want to deal with him still now. And when he talks about Jerusalem, they go
berserk.
Right. And my point is that there was a time in which Israelis, they may want to deal with him now because he's weak and because they believe, that it's the best time to make things happen, and because they think that he is the best person to make things happen with. But it's, some might say, the Palestinians' fault that they select their leader, so don't criticize the leader for the problems.
No, I think that you're partly right. I think that's very fair. There's no question that we've been very forgiving in our leadership. Don't forget, however, that we have no sovereignty. We have no place. I mean, Arafat was exiled to Tunis in 1982 from Beirut. We are a divided population. Some of us are Israeli citizens. There are 2 million Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza. There are 4 million who are outside of Palestine. This is quite interesting. Most of the Palestinian population today does not live on historical Palestine. They live in the diaspora, in exile, in Lebanon and Jordan and so on and so forth. There's a very difficult circumstance. Israel had the United States.
And the United States.
200,000 in this country. We have never had a strategic partner the way Israel has had the United States. I mean, with the end of the Cold War, we were, and the Soviet Union wasn't much help.
And whose fault is that?
No, these are all, I think, objective circumstances. These are the realities of the situation. The Arab world itself is a treacherous environment. Every Palestine being the big cause of every Arab, right? So it was a question of who could capture Palestine as a tool of his or her own foreign policy. And so there was always a fight between the PLO and the other Arab states.
There was
Egypt,
a time
Syria.
that Syria wanted to take
went
it
to
over.
war. Went to war in 1983. They tried to destroy the PLO. So given all of that, there was a general feeling, shared by me among others, that he was our leader. He represented Palestine. He still does. He's a very popular man at one point. So you go along with him. And what developed, you see, was a sense that this forgave everything, that he could do anything. Now, we were all aware that in Tunis, and certainly in Beirut before that, he was essentially a tyrant in the sense that he wanted to do everything himself. You needed something.
And not a Democrat.
Well,
a little d.
Because of the circumstances of our existence, he couldn't control everything. So I could say whatever I wanted. I mean, he couldn't get back at me in any way or do anything to me. But what bothers me is that after, I think, 91, the Madrid conference, when I was very involved in the negotiations up until then I got ill and I resigned. I was a member of the council, as you say. What happened was, I think there was a sudden opening. There was a feeling that after the Gulf War, the Bush administration, that somehow Palestinians for the first time were being recognized. And that sense of recognition overshadowed everything else. The sense finally we were able, don't forget we were ostracized by the United States, not by the rest of the world, but by the United States.
You had to have secret meetings.
Exactly. So there was all of that going on. And I think where we went wrong, in my opinion, was a sense of rushing too quickly, and saying, let's take what we can get, without remembering the realities of the situation, and that what we were taking, what Arafat was taking. You see, at that point, he'd gone out of control. No, he consulted nobody on this secret deal with the Israelis in Oslo. And by that time...
that probably was necessary. You know what I mean?
Some kind of... No, I'm not complaining about the secrecy as such, but I mean, it covered a great deal of ground. Right. And what I think he did was to just give away a lot. Fine. But what bothers me, you see, is not that. I mean, we are weak. There's no question about it. But A, he killed the spirit of the Intifada, which had brought us many gains, right? Yes. And the spirit of resistance. He personally canceled that. He just said, well, we're stopping that, right? And number two, in my opinion, there wasn't honesty. You know, had he said, this is all we can get, this is a tragedy, we've lost Palestine, this is a flawed deal in the extreme, fight with me, help me. He didn't do that. He lied. He said, this is a great achievement. He stood on the White House lawn, he celebrated. He forgave Rabin. I mean, Rabin to us is the great criminal, don't forget. I mean, Rabin was personally responsible for making of refugees in 1948, 50,000 people he kicked out of Ramla and Lid. He was the man who was behind, he was the Minister of Defense during the Intifada. He's the man who said, break their bones and all the rest of it. Far more Palestinians were killed than Israelis were. So there was this collective amnesia. And I am ashamed that so many Palestinians went along with this in the, I think, foolish hope that it was suddenly going to turn into a wonderful thing. But if you read the text, not many people have read the text of the Declaration of Principles or the Cairo Accord. Many Israelis have said it's a disgraceful document. There isn't a single whit iota of generosity in it. It just compels Palestinians to be endlessly subordinate to Israel. It keeps the settlements in place. It keeps the army in place. And by and large, it gives the Palestinians what they call limited autonomy, but no self-determination. And I would have settled for self-determination as the goal, but it's not specified in that.
Yeah, but I mean, here is the other argument being made, and right. I hear you on that. And let me just talk about Arafat for a second.
Right.
You called him in '83 a man of audacity and vision. You followed that in '86, tragic and fascinating figure. In '88, you said he secured a place in Palestinian history. And then in '93, you say foolish man who misunderstands his own people, and that the autocracy, the profligacy, and the corruption and the stupidity were all there for you to understand, and nobody was able and willing to speak to it.
No, that's not true. A lot of people spoke, including myself. I mean, there was a constant, of course, on the major issues, up until 1988, when we, I was a member of the National Council, and I was one of the drafters of the thing that recognized Israel and so on and so forth, said we have to have two states.
Right.
He was part of the national consensus. It's after that that the change occurs. I mean, people change, sure. I mean, I'm not saying he still is a tragic figure. He still is a fascinating man. He's one of the...
He still has a place in the history of Palestine.
Of course. I mean, and that's what I said. I mean, he brought us to this point. But my point right now is that he should resign. He's done what he can do. There is nothing... He is unreformable. He cannot... He's never lived in a civil society. I mean, our new needs are to try to construct, in spite of the obstacles of the current situation, the lack of money, the chaos, et cetera, the years of occupation. You need a new set of goals, right? And he's incapable of providing them. That's what I'm saying.
And the argument is made, though, that he is still the one figure in which more Palestinians, both inside and outside, would you prefer to be Palestine, now the West Bank,
right.
More
for
United
the time
States,
being.
He's the one figure that everybody can rally around.
Well, for the time being, but he is not, I don't think, the man, mark my words, I mean, I'm not a prophet, but my feeling is that he's now at the end of his tether. He has reached where he's going to reach. He's never going to get out of Gaza. He's not going to be able to increase the amount of self-determination that we have. We need a new generation. He's in his middle 60s, he's quite ill. He's out of touch.
From?
He has various illnesses. Right. I think many of them the result of his plane crash in 1991 or 92. And he's very, very, very tense. I mean, he has now surrounded himself by security apparatus. I mean, the idea that we fought all of these, we've made all of these enormous sacrifices. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed or dispersed, and losses. We lost Palestine. I mean, it's a tragic fact. The Palestine I was born in no longer exists. We've lost it, and a new people have supplanted us and taken our land and lived there. It's a fact. It's Israel, right? But we have 20% of this left on the West Bank and Gaza, and that 20%, about 50% of it is already gone, as Israelis will tell you, through the settlements, the confiscations, and so on and so forth. The question is, can you do anything with what's left? I think you need a new vision. You need a new generation of leaders who are developing. Don't forget, we're 6 million people. We're a gifted population. And I think in time he will begin, the slow process of beginning to fail, which is very tragic. And more losses will occur, more killings. And
well, the argument from the Israeli side, in part, though, their practical reality, they would say, is that you better deal with Arafat
right.
and the PLO.
Of course, and Jordan. And
because Hamas has a very different agenda.
That's not true, actually. I mean, that's one of the sort of propaganda things.
From,
well, first of all, they were the people who, the Israeli government supported Hamas in the beginning. I mean, they were anxious to get something as an alternative to the PLO. But if you look at the facts and the figures, the fact is that Hamas has never gotten more than about 14 or 15% of any poll on the West Bank and Gaza. They represent now a kind of protest movement. They simply say, we are not interested in this kind of arrangement. Although at the same time, they're very interested in sharing power, if there's any power to be shared with. On the other hand, do they represent an alternative? I mean, do they put forward
a different philosophy?
No, absolutely not.
No,
I don't think so.
Philosophy?
I mean, I've talked to them, I've seen their thing. They don't mobilize people. And that's the problem with them. I think the alternative, what I think the Israelis want, you see, is Arafat as their enforcer on the West Bank and Gaza. He is now responsible. It's cheaper than having the Israelis do it. He does it for them. On the West Bank, not on the West Bank, in Jericho and Gaza. Gaza, they couldn't rule.
What do you mean by enforcer?
He is supposed to provide them with security, right? And he is responsible. Gaza is one of the most fractious and rebellious places. And that's where the Intifada started. Now it's his problem, not the Israelis. The Israelis control the borders, who goes in and out. But what occurs inside Gaza, which is a hellhole, and there are tough and brave and fighting people. And you can read in the papers yesterday, I think in the New York Times, there's an article about his problems in Gaza. He can't deal with it, right? Well, so the Israelis are, laughing all the way to the bank because he says, let him deal with it.
Yeah, but they're not laughing when they see people that show up at a newspaper and say, you got to stop publishing.
Exactly. Well, I mean, they did that. Of course, the Israelis did that, and now he's doing it. His model is precisely every other Arab state, whether it's Iraq or Syria or any of the others, that says, if you don't say what we like, we're going to shut you down. Yeah. But he will have a fight on his hand because Palestinians are not like the Syrians or the others, because they have a history of fighting exactly that kind of thing. And they're not going to take it from their own leaders any more than they took it from the Israelis.
And he's deeply threatened by the agreement with Jordan, and certainly when you speak about the religious shrines, that becomes...
Well, I mean, it was a calculated... I think, frankly, the situation of Jordan is as follows. I think King Hussein is a very sick man, physically. Right. I think that he has been deeply despondent because of what happened to him during the Gulf War, because the Palestinians didn't coordinate with him. What does he have to lose? He gets his debt forgiven, he gets some American aid, he basks in the spotlight, he's okay. And of course the Israelis added that thing about Jerusalem just to embarrass Arafat. So it's cynical, I think.
Let me present an alternative scenario than the one you hold. Right. It is the following. Rabin, whatever you say about Yitzhak Rabin, he is a different person now, and he sees his own sense of history and his moment. And he's out front realizing that he's got to change, that he's got to give up territory, that he's got to make peace. And he will make peace with Syria. He'll give him back the Golan, most of the Golan. And
but you see, the thing with Syria is not the Golan.
I know. Well, what?
Oh, I think it's a lot of things like what happened in Iraq. I think they want the demilitarization of the whole area between the Golan Heights and Damascus. They're talking about specific reductions.
What's wrong with that?
Well, I'm just telling you. I mean, but the Israelis are not making the same commitments. I mean, the United States is giving the Israelis more F-15s and F-16s, whereas the Syrians are being asked to cut down their missiles, their military, their aircraft, and so on and so forth. So what you have is a reduction in the net strength of Syria as a deterrent to Israel.
But
so
if
that
it
Israel
accomplishes their goal of getting the Golan back, why shouldn't they do that?
Well, you see, that's the hesitation, because he gets the Golan back, and it weakens him. I mean, we're talking about dictatorships now in the Middle East, all of whom are hanging by the balance, and but the point is that
clearly
Israel...
Assad can risk. It is not a risk to him if he gets the Golan back, no matter what demilitarization takes place between Damascus and the Golan, is it? I mean, if he doesn't get the Golan back, you might say there's a risk to the dictatorship.
Well, we don't know that he's going to get the Golan back and how he's going to get it, because the Israelis talk about stages. I'm not sure.
Well, you just said there'd be a peace treaty. And what's going to be in the peace between Israel and Syria?
There have been peace treaties with the Jordanians and the Palestinians that are...
Well, with the Egyptians got back to Sinai, and Jordan...
But the question is normalization. You see, what they want is also normalization. I mean, so that the markets are open.
They also want a good relationship with the United States.
Well, of course. No, I'm talking about the Israelis. You see what the Israelis want. Anyway, I think... You're right. I mean, we both agree that there is going to be a kind of generalized peace.
Why?
But it's a peace that, if I...
No, I'm sorry.
No, it's just a peace that I think in the end favors the Israelis overwhelmingly, because they represent the largest force, the most powerful country, and the most powerful economy. I think the secret of all of these agreements is economic. I mean, there's now, for example, a plan to build a major highway network from Turkey through Israel into the Gulf. There's talk about a Middle East common market and so on and so forth. Now, we're dealing with Arab governments and Arab economies that are much more weak than that of Israel. And in this, certain sectors will profit, but by and large, the Middle East will remain pretty much as it is in the Arab world. And so that's all I'm saying. I mean, I think that's the reality.
Let me finish my point earlier, which was, before we got off on Syria, it is that Rabin is a different man, and he really is trying to, he has some sense. I think they clearly were shaken by the Intifada. I mean, they just shaken the whole country, right?
Right.
As well they should have been.
Exactly. It was a 27-year-old military
extraordinary
occupation.
moment in Palestinian,
right, exactly.
In the evolution of the Palestinian. Secondly, it shook Israel, and therefore Rabin now looks at this time and says, look, there's an end of the Cold War, a lot of reasons we ought to make peace here, and this notion of the positions we have held to for so long don't play anymore.
Right.
The Israelis want peace.
Right.
Okay? And now let's try to reach out and and everything has to do with what's politically viable, and leadership means you try to bring your people with you,
right.
or you try to go further than they may be wanting to go. But he also is walking a tightrope, as Arafat is, and others might be less so.
But Israel has the power, you see, Charlie, and this is what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
Israel has all the cards. Given what we now see, I'm just talking now about the Palestinian side, because that's the issue. It's not Syria, the Golan Heights, or Jordan, because the disputed territory is Jerusalem and the West Bank. And these, they're biblical and all kinds of cultural things that are much more important than anything to do with Syria or Jordan. What we've seen so far, what Israeli commentators have themselves said about the current crop of agreements, beginning with the September 13th Declaration of Principles through the Cairo Agreement and the Paris Economic Agreement, are all designed to keep Israel at a tremendous advantage on the West Bank and Gaza, right? Where the markets are guaranteed for Israel, cheap labor for Israel, right? Where Palestinian self-determination and the idea of what we accept in South Africa and everywhere else in the world is simply denying Palestinians. There's no sovereignty. Israel controls everything. First of all, has been put off to 1996. They're changing the demography. They're changing the geography. They're taking more land. And what I'm saying is what is being designed for Palestinians is, in effect, a kind of Bantustan, where Palestinians will not have...
This government in Israel today is not in favor of increasing the number of settlements. That's not their policy.
But they have increased the number of, not the number, but they've increased the size of the settlements.
In terms of the number of people that are going
number
into the
of people
settlements.
and number and acres.
But there is also talk that they're willing to withdraw from some of those settlements and draw maybe those right around Jerusalem.
Well, why hasn't any of that been undertaken in writing? You see, I mean, we're talking about solemn international agreements in which Israel doesn't even admit that it's an occupying power. Israel simply talks about itself as an administrative power, but the reality on the ground is that Palestinians are being more divided on the West Bank through these settlements, which into about 10 cantons. They're like, divisions on the West Bank, where the settlements are contiguous to each other through the road system, but the Palestinians have to go through Israeli barricades to reach other Palestinian settlements. Now, I'm simply saying it's not a prognosis for an optimistic look to the future. What they're laying the seeds for, I think, is a postponement of the conflict rather than the reconciliation that you and I want and that I would expect from the Israelis as the more powerful. Now, we've recognized them. We've recognized their existence. They haven't recognized our national existence. Are you saying
you somehow think the Israelis want to colonize the Palestinians?
Well, I think they want them in a subservient place. I think there are limits to what you refer to as Rabin's change, and people are also subject to their own history. Yeah. And I think Rabin's history with the Palestinians, if you read the Israeli press, which I read all the time, most commentators say that Rabin really hasn't changed. Peres is described as a man of vision, but Rabin seems to be pretty much the same. Of course, playing to the whole idea of peace and so on and so forth. But with regard to the Palestinians, the same.
I mean, I read of some of those same.
But Palestinian life on the West Bank and Gaza has gotten worse, Charlie, since the agreement was signed. So the question is, when is this change going to occur? And can one simply trust the documents? And if you look at the documents and if you look at the facts, the prognosis is very, to me, bleak. That's what I'm saying. So we need further change. And I think it's important, therefore, to speak out on these matters and say, this is the problem.
There's so much to talk about. Let me just, I want to take note of Representations of the Intellectual, which is a series of your writings, and also The Politics of Dispossession, which is about the struggle for determination between the period in which you wrote 1969 to 94.
Right.
Has your illness does it have any influence on the way you view these things? And I mean by that causing you to look at things in a different time frame.
Well, I think I look at them more seriously.
No.
You know, I think that the important thing is to try as much as possible to tell the truth from as wide a perspective as possible, and, you know, to try and look at things from the point of view of the essential, you know, rather than, you know, the sort of media aspect of it and so on and so forth. Right. And I think it makes one take responsibility more seriously. Yes, I think so. I think so, because I really feel that I'm not going to have a chance to say more things for a very long time. I will be able to continue to talk and write. You know, I mean, I hope my health improves enough. But yeah, I think so. It makes me take the notion of being an intellectual more seriously, and you know, and to risk more, and to just say, you know, things that perhaps I would have been more cautious about.
Because the denunciation of Arafat has been much stronger in the last year.
That's right.
At least in terms of the years, my years.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. I mean, and that, of course, occurred because I was profoundly shocked by the dimensions of our capitulation, I feel. But I also think it's important to try as much as possible to raise consciousness. You know, I mean, a lot of what I write is not only written for Americans, but for my own people.
You write in Arabic.
I write in Arabic as well. And so it's important to try as much as possible to tell the truth. And I think there I've largely succeeded. I mean, because it's interesting that they haven't responded to me.
Well, but Arafat gave you the back of his hand in a sense by saying, well, I've heard this criticism, doesn't matter.
No, he didn't actually say that. He just said that he said that you know, Edward Said is far away.
Yeah,
but he was in Tunis at the time.
Well, yeah, I know, but it was a criticism. I mean, he's over in the United States, where he sits in his
right.
comfortable university position, and I'm over here, part of the struggle, trying to move from house to house every night to stay alive.
Yes, right. Well, I mean, that's not a response, is it? I mean, I'm simply putting forward as much as I can facts. Realities, truths,
let me just,
and they need to be responded to.
Okay, here is I'm almost out of time. Yeah. Do you think that your voice and others will precipitate some kind of debate?
It has already.
That's going on right now within the Palestinian community over what truths ought we face and what realities
Every day brings me more news and more people asking to have more public meetings. We have to air this, and you know, people in the end are not. I'm not saying it's because of me, but I think the kind of criticism, the kind of intellectual position that I've taken has emboldened other people who are now asking a question. You know, our leaders have to be accountable to us.
I leave with this. What do you hope to accomplish by being as candid and outspoken as you are? As you know, as I mentioned. You look and say, I may only have a few number of years, however it might be, to get my thing done, to have an impact beyond what I already have.
Yes.
What is it you want to do?
I think the main thing is to get more people to participate, you know, in our community. I mean, there are 6 million Palestinians. More people have to come forward and say, this is what we feel, because we're all involved. It's our future as a people. Let's not leave it just to them, number one. And number two, to make as much as possible the leadership of our people accountable to the people. The idea is we have to speak a language in which people have to respond to us when we say, well, what have you done? This is happening now. This is happening now. He has to face this. And I think it's part of a general Arab trend. It's not just Palestinian, because my stuff is circulated throughout the Arab world.
There have been too many demagogues
exactly,
and too many dictators.
And I think that's the important thing. It's the opening of a debate on democracy and responsibility and participation.
And hopefully in that process we can also eliminate stereotypes.
Absolutely. The main thing are the cliches that just say, oh, it's a wonderful thing, and you know, all that kind of stuff.
Great to have you here. Edward W. Said, always a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
We'll be right back. We'll talk about memory and how dream affects memory and processes memory, and also more. Back in a moment.